The town mocked his stutter, until he took the stage and brought the crowd to tears. Welcome to Dusk Tales. Let's uncover what really happened. The town of Harmony Creek was a postcard painting of a life Leo Finch could only observe from behind glass. He was the town librarian, a quiet sentinel in a fortress of forgotten stories. His own story trapped behind a stutter that had been his lifelong, unwelcome companion. The stutter was a cruel cage, turning simple hellos into agonizing battles and heartfelt opinions into fragmented, misunderstood whispers. To the people of Harmony Creek, a town that valued smooth talk and easy confidence, Leo was an anomaly, an object of pity for the kind, and a target of casual cruelty for the rest. He was LL Leo, the librarian, a nickname that echoed in the whispers of teenagers and the condescending smiles of adults. His sanctuary was the library, a hushed, hallowed space where the air smelled of aging paper and leather binding. Here, amidst the towering shelves, he was not the stutterer. He was a custodian of worlds, a silent guide to a million different lives. The words on the page were perfect, fluid, and beautiful. They did not catch in the throat or die on the tongue. They soared. He devoured poetry, finding solace in the rhythm and cadence of language, in a way poets could distill a universe of feeling into a single, perfect line. He understood the power of words better than anyone, yet he was denied the simple pleasure of speaking them freely. His torment had a name: Richard Rick Thorne. Rick was Harmony Creek's golden boy, the former high school quarterback who had leveraged his family's wealth and his own boundless arrogance into a successful real estate development business. He moved through the town with an air of entitled ownership, his voice a booming baritone that commanded attention, his smile a weapon of condescending charm. Rick saw Leo not as a man, but as a walking punchline, a convenient, easy target to reaffirm his own superiority. His mockery was relentless, public, and designed to inflict maximum humiliation. He'd encounter Leo at the general store and ask for a recommendation on a teach thriller, his voice a cruel parody of Leo's struggle. He'd see him at the diner and loudly ask if Leo was stuck on the first word of his order. The townspeople, caught in Rick's gravitational pull of charisma and power, would often snicker along, their laughter a chorus of casual betrayal that chipped away at Leo's already fragile spirit. One person, however, saw beyond the stutter. Mrs. Gable, the owner of the town's only diner, was a woman whose kindness was as warm and comforting as the coffee she served. She had known Leo since he was a boy, had seen the bright, intelligent light in his eyes long before the stutter had taken root. In her diner, he found a small measure of peace. She would listen patiently, never finishing his sentences, her eyes filled with a steady, unwavering warmth that spoke of a deeper understanding. She saw the poet in him, the quiet observer, the man whose mind moved with a grace his tongue could not match. But the diner was a small island in a vast ocean of misunderstanding. Leo's life was a study in quiet endurance, a daily navigation of a world that seemed designed to remind him of his own perceived inadequacy. He found his joy in the silent companionship of books, in the imagined voices of poets long dead, and in the quiet, unspoken support of Mrs. Gable. He had accepted his fate, resigned to a life lived in the margins, his own voice a prisoner within him. He did not know that the quiet, predictable rhythm of his life was about to be shattered by an event that would force him to confront his deepest fears, to challenge the very foundations of his solitary existence, and to find a voice he never knew he possessed in the most public and terrifying way imaginable. The town of Harmony Creek thought they knew Leo Finch. They were about to learn how wrong they were. The inciting incident, the spark that would ignite the dormant fire within Leo, arrived not with a bang, but with the quiet, bureaucratic hum of a town council meeting. The meeting, held in the stuffy, wood-paneled community hall, was sparsely attended, mostly by the usual cohort of town elders and business owners. The main item on the agenda was a proposal by Rick Thorne himself, a project he had grandly titled the Harmony Creek Gateway. The Gateway was a soulless, sprawling development plan that would demolish a block of historic, albeit neglected, downtown buildings, including the old community theater where Leo's parents had first met, to make way for a sterile complex of chain stores, a multiplex cinema, and a luxury condo building. Rick presented his proposal with his usual theatrical flair, his voice booming with confidence, his charts and graphs promising a future of economic prosperity and modern convenience. He spoke of progress, of revitalization, of shedding the dead weight of the past. The phrase dead weight hung in the air, a thinly veiled insult to the town's history, a history that Leo cherished, a history that lived and breathed in the very books he so carefully curated. Leo sat in the back, his heart a leaden weight in his chest. He had come to the meeting out of a sense of civic duty, but now he felt a surge of profound, indignant outrage. The old theater, the quaint, family-owned shops, the very soul of Harmony Creek. Rick was proposing to bulldoze it all, to replace it with a generic, plastic replica of 100 other towns. He saw the way the town council members, including the pliable Mayor Thompson, nodded along, their eyes alight with the promise of increased tax revenue, their minds seemingly closed to the cultural devastation Rick was proposing. He had to say something. The thought was a terrifying jolt, a physical shock that sent a wave of cold dread through him. To speak in public, in front of the council, in front of Rick, was to willingly walk into the lion's den, to offer himself up for a public mauling. But the image of the old theater, the memory of his parents' stories, the love he held for the town's quiet, unassuming history. It was a force more powerful than his fear. He felt a desperate, almost physical need to defend it. With a pounding heart and trembling hands, Leo stood up. The sudden movement, the sight of the stuttering librarian, rising to speak, sent a ripple of surprised murmurs through the small crowd. Rick Thorne, at the podium, paused his presentation, a slow, predatory smile spreading across his face. He saw an opportunity for entertainment, a chance to publicly cement his power by crushing the town's weakest voice. "Mr. Finch," Mayor Thompson said, his tone a mixture of surprise and barely concealed annoyance. "Do you have something to add?" Leo's throat was dry. He could feel every eye in the room on him, a heavy, suffocating weight. He opened his mouth, the words, so clear and passionate in his mind, catching on the jagged edges of his stutter. "Mr. Mayor," he began, the first word a monumental struggle. A few snickers, quickly suppressed, rippled through the audience. Rick leaned against the podium, crossing his arms, his expression one of pure, unadulterated amusement. I think this PP project is a mistake." Each word was a battle, a small, agonizing victory against the rebellion of his own body. He wanted to speak of history, of soul, of the things that couldn't be measured in profit margins. But the words wouldn't come. Rick, seeing his chance, stepped forward. "I think what Mr. F.F. Finch is trying to say," he interjected, his voice a perfect, cruel imitation of Leo's struggle, "is that he's having a hard TT time with the idea of PP progress. Maybe we should get him a picture book so he can understand the pretty new buildings." The hall erupted in laughter. Not just snickers now, but open, unrestrained guffaws. The council members, even Mayor Thompson, chuckled, their discomfort momentarily forgotten in the wave of collective cruelty. Leo stood there, frozen, the blood draining from his face. The laughter was a physical blow, a wave of sound that washed over him, drowning him in shame and humiliation. His impassioned defense of his town had been reduced to a pathetic, stuttering joke. He couldn't speak. He couldn't move. He simply turned and walked out of the hall, the sound of the laughter following him. A scar burned into his soul. He had tried to be a voice for the voiceless, and he had been silenced, not just by his stutter, but by the casual, crushing cruelty of the man who held the town in his thrall. As he stepped out into the cold night air, his heart a shattered wreck, he knew that something had to change. He couldn't live like this anymore. The fight for Harmony Creek's soul had just become inextricably linked with the fight for his own. The humiliation of the town, council meeting clung to Leo like a shroud. He retreated into his sanctuary, the library, but even its hallowed silence offered little comfort. The memory of the laughter of Rick Thorne's mocking imitation replayed in his mind, a relentless, torturous loop. He felt exposed, foolish, and profoundly powerless. The whispers in town grew louder, more pointed. The story of his failed attempt to speak had become a local anecdote, a piece of small-town lore that reaffirmed his status as LL Leo, the librarian, the man whose words were as broken as his spirit. He saw the pitying glances, the quickly suppressed smirks, everywhere he went. He started to avoid the general store, sending away for his groceries, further shrinking his already small world. His only refuge was Mrs. Gable's diner. He would go late in the evening, when the crowds had thinned, and sit in his usual corner booth, a book open before him as a shield. Mrs. Gable, with her innate, quiet wisdom, never mentioned the meeting. She simply refilled his coffee cup, her movements gentle, her presence a silent, unwavering affirmation of his worth. One evening, as Leo sat nursing a cold coffee, his gaze lost in the rain-streaked window, Mrs. Gable slid into the booth opposite him. "Leo," she began, her voice soft but firm, "don't you let that man, that windbag, put out your light." Leo flinched, his eyes dropping to the table. He didn't, he stammered, the words a lie he couldn't even make himself believe. He just PP proved what everyone already knows. Mrs. Gable reached across the table and placed her warm, work-worn hand over his. "What they think they know, Leo," she corrected him gently. "They see the struggle. They don't see the words. I do. I read the poems you used to write in high school, the ones you were too shy to share. I see the way you look at this town, the love you have for its history. You have a poet's soul, Leo, and a poet's voice is more than just the sounds he makes with his mouth." Her words were a balm, a tiny spark in the overwhelming darkness of his self-doubt. A poet's soul. He hadn't thought of himself that way in years. It was a dream he had packed away, along with so many others, in the dusty attic of his youth. Just then, a flyer, tacked to the diner's community bulletin board, caught his eye. It was brightly colored, almost aggressively cheerful. "Harmony Creek Founders Day celebration," it proclaimed. And beneath the schedule of events, a parade, a bake-off, a fireworks display, was a small, boxed-off announcement. "The first annual Voice of Harmony Creek contest. Share your story, your song, your poem. What does Harmony Creek mean to you? Grand prize, $1,000, and the honor of lighting the Founders Day bonfire." The Voice of Harmony Creek. The irony was so bitter, so profound, it was almost laughable. A public speaking contest in a town that mocked him for his inability to speak. It seemed like a cruel joke, a cosmic taunt designed specifically for him. His first instinct was to dismiss it, to turn away, to retreat back into the safety of his silence. But then, he looked at Mrs. Gable's kind, expectant face. He thought of Rick Thorne's soulless development plan, a plan that was moving forward unopposed. He thought of the old theater, the quiet streets, the very soul of the town he loved, being bulldozed into oblivion. And a new, terrifying, yet strangely exhilarating thought began to form in his mind. What if he could find another way to speak? What if he could use the very platform designed for confident voices to deliver a message from a silent one? The thought was insane. It was terrifying. It was a direct challenge to every fear, every insecurity, every humiliation he had ever endured. It was an invitation to a public execution, a chance for Rick Thorne to deliver the final, killing blow in front of the entire town. But as he sat there, in the quiet warmth of Mrs. Gable's diner, with her hand still on his, the insane, terrifying thought began to feel less like a path to destruction and more like the only path to salvation. The Voice of Harmony Creek contest. It was an impossible mountain to climb. But for the first time in a long, long time, Leo Finch felt the faintest, almost imperceptible urge to try. The poet's soul, long dormant, had begun to stir. The decision to enter the contest was not a sudden epiphany, but a slow, agonizing dawning. For days, Leo wrestled with himself, his mind a battlefield of fear and a nascent, desperate hope. The thought of standing on a stage, in front of the entire town, a microphone his enemy, was a vision of pure, unadulterated terror. He imagined the smirks, the whispers, the inevitable, crushing humiliation when his stutter would, undoubtedly, betray him. He saw Rick Thorne's triumphant, mocking face, a permanent fixture in his nightmares. He nearly abandoned the idea 100 times, retreating to the quiet safety of his books, telling himself it was a fool's errand, a masochistic impulse. But then he would see the wrecking ball in his mind's eye, swinging towards the old community theater. He would hear Rick Thorne's booming voice, talking about dead weight and progress, and the quiet, stubborn fire of his indignation would burn a little brighter. He knew he couldn't deliver a traditional speech. The mechanics of it, the simple act of forming sentences in a linear, conversational way, was his personal hell. But Mrs. Gable's words, a poet's soul, echoed in his mind. He wasn't a speaker. He was a writer, a lover of words, of rhythm, of cadence. And in that distinction, a fragile, daring plan began to form. He wouldn't speak. He would recite. He would craft his message not as prose, but as poetry, a lyrical ode to the town he loved, a quiet rebellion against the soulless future Rick Thorne was trying to sell. He started to work in secret. After the library had closed its doors for the night, the vast, silent space his only confidant. Under the warm, golden glow of a single desk lamp, surrounded by the silent, sleeping stories of generations, Leo began to write. The words at first came in a trickle, then a flood. He wrote about the crooked smile of the old clock tower, the way the sunlight filtered through the leaves of the ancient oak in the town square, the ghosts of laughter in the empty community theater. He wrote about the quiet dignity of the farmers, the weary hope in the eyes of the shopkeepers, the shared history that was etched into the very sidewalks. He contrasted this living, breathing soul of Harmony Creek with the cold, sterile vision of Rick's Gateway, a place of polished stone and empty promises. It was a love letter to his town, a passionate defense of its flawed, beautiful heart. As he wrote, he began to experiment. He read the lines aloud, not as a speech, but as a song, a chant, a piece of spoken word poetry. He discovered something miraculous. When he focused on the rhythm, on the musicality of the language, on the rise and fall of the verses, the stutter, his lifelong tormentor, seemed to loosen its grip. It was still there, a shadow in the corner, but it no longer held him in a chokehold. The cadence of the poetry provided a smooth, flowing river for his words to travel upon, bypassing the jagged rocks of his anxiety. He practiced for hours, his voice, usually so hesitant, growing stronger, more confident with each repetition. He memorized the lines, letting them become a part of him, an extension of his very being. The library, his sanctuary, became his rehearsal stage. The silent, leather-bound books were his audience, their quiet wisdom offering a non-judgmental embrace. He paced the aisles, his voice echoing softly in the hallowed space, the words of his poem becoming a shield, a sword, a declaration of his intent. This was his secret weapon, his hidden talent. Not a perfect voice, not a singer's voice, but a poet's voice, one that could weave words into a tapestry of emotion and meaning. He was still terrified. The thought of performing in front of a real, living, breathing audience, an audience that included Rick Thorne, was a knot of ice in his stomach. But now he had something to cling to. He had his words. He had his rhythm. He had his truth. He went to the town hall the day before the registration deadline and, with a trembling hand, filled out the form. He wrote his name, Leo Finch, in the blank space, his heart pounding a frantic, defiant rhythm against his ribs. The clerk, a woman who had known him for years, looked at him with surprise, then a flicker of pity. "Good luck, Leo," she said, her voice gentle, but her eyes betraying her doubt. Leo simply nodded, unable to form a reply. He walked out of the town hall, his registration form assigned, sealed declaration of war. The quiet librarian was going to take the stage, and he was going to fight. The news that Leo, the librarian, had officially entered the Voice of Harmony Creek contest spread through the town like a slow, incredulous ripple. At first, it was treated as a joke, a piece of bizarre gossip whispered over coffee at Mrs. Gable's diner and in the aisles of the general store. The idea of Leo Finch, a man who struggled to get through a simple sentence, willingly stepping onto a public stage was so absurd, so out of character, that most people assumed it was a misunderstanding, a prank. But when the official list of contestants was posted on the town hall bulletin board, and his name was there, in his own neat, careful handwriting, the incredulity shifted to a mixture of pity and a cruel, morbid anticipation. For Rick Thorne, the news was a gift from the heavens. He saw it as the ultimate opportunity to cement his dominance, to deliver a final, public, and utterly devastating blow to the one man who had dared to weakly challenge him. The contest, in his mind, was no longer just about promoting his development project. It was about orchestrating a grand finale of humiliation for Leo. He began his campaign of psychological warfare immediately. He would accidentally run into Leo at the post office, his voice dripping with false concern. "Leo, my man, I heard you're entering the contest," he'd say, clapping a heavy, condescending hand on Leo's shoulder. "That's brave. Really brave. You sure you're up for it? The whole town will be watching. No PP pressure, though." The subtle, cruel mimicry was a constant, deliberate jab, designed to amplify Leo's anxiety, to make him doubt himself, to break him before he even reached the stage. One afternoon, Rick took it a step further. He came into the library, not to check out a book, but to intimidate. He strode through the quiet, hallowed space as if he owned it, his booming voice a sacrilege in the hushed atmosphere. He found Leo reshelving books in the history section, Leo's personal sanctuary. "Finch," Rick said, his voice a low, menacing growl. "I think we need to have a little chat. About this contest. I don't know what you think you're going to accomplish, but you're making a fool of yourself. And you're making this town look bad. You should do everyone a favor and just drop out. Save yourself the embarrassment." Leo, cornered between a shelf of Civil War biographies and Rick's imposing figure, felt a wave of cold, primal fear. His hands trembled, and he could feel his throat tightening, the stutter threatening to seize him completely. He wanted to shrink, to disappear into the pages of the books around him. But then he thought of his poem. He thought of the words he had so carefully crafted, the truth he was determined to speak. A tiny, defiant spark ignited within him. I each have a right to be there, Rick," Leo managed to say, his voice a strained whisper. Rick let out a short, derisive laugh. "All right? You have a right to make a fool of yourself. Fine. Be my guest. I'll be in the front row, Finch, with a scorecard. It's going to be the most entertaining part of the whole day." He turned and sauntered out, leaving Leo trembling, his heart pounding, his confidence shattered. The encounter shook Leo to his core. The fear, which he had managed to keep at bay during his secret rehearsals, came flooding back, a suffocating tide. He went home that night and stared at his poem, the beautiful, powerful words now seeming like a cruel mockery. He couldn't do it. He couldn't face them. He couldn't face Rick. In a fit of despair, he crumpled the pages, ready to throw them into the fireplace, to surrender to his fear, to retreat back into the safety of his silence. But as he held the crumpled ball of paper, his eyes fell on a framed photograph on his mantelpiece. It was a picture of his parents, smiling, standing in front of the old community theater, the very building Rick wanted to demolish. He remembered his father, a man of quiet strength, who had always told him, "Leo, your voice is in your heart, not just on your tongue. Don't ever let anyone silence your heart." And then a different memory surfaced, a darker one. The memory of the day the stutter began. He was a small boy, 7 years old, a witness to a sudden, terrifying car accident. He had tried to scream, to call for help, but the shock had frozen his words, turning his cry into a choked, silent stutter. The trauma of that moment, the feeling of being voiceless in a moment of desperate need, had become his cage. He looked at the crumpled poem in his hand. This was his chance to break the cage, to find his voice, not by screaming, but by speaking his truth in his own way. He slowly, carefully uncrumpled the pages, smoothing them out on the table. His words, stared back at him, a silent, powerful army waiting for their general. The fear was still there, a cold, heavy knot in his stomach. But now, it was accompanied by something else, a fierce, unyielding resolve. He would not let Rick Thorne win. He would not let the laughter of the crowd silence him. He would not let the ghost of that terrified 7-year-old boy control him any longer. He was going to take the stage. The weight of his decision pressed down on Leo, a physical presence in his small, quiet house. He knew he was standing on the precipice of a life-altering choice. The path of retreat was easy, familiar, a return to the quiet, albeit painful, safety of his library stacks. The path forward was a terrifying, unknown wilderness, fraught with the danger of public humiliation, a landscape he had spent his entire life avoiding. He felt the old, familiar tendrils of fear coiling around his heart, whispering a siren's song of surrender. It's not worth it. They won't listen. You'll only make it worse. The voice of his self-doubt was a constant, insidious companion. He knew he couldn't face this alone. The next evening, seeking a final refuge from the storm in his own mind, he found himself walking to Mrs. Gable's diner. The warm, yellow light spilling from its windows was a beacon in the twilight, a promise of sanctuary. The diner was quiet, the last of the dinner crowd having departed, leaving only the comforting smell of coffee and baked goods. Mrs. Gable was behind the counter, wiping it down with a practiced, steady hand. She looked up as he entered, her eyes, kind and perceptive, immediately sensing his turmoil. "Leo," she said, her voice a soft, gentle query. "You look like you've got the weight of the world on your shoulders." He sank into his usual booth, the worn vinyl a familiar comfort. He couldn't bring himself to speak, to even attempt to navigate the treacherous terrain of his stutter. He simply laid the smoothed-out pages of his poem on the table, his hands trembling slightly. Mrs. Gable came over and sat opposite him. She didn't press him to talk. She just looked at the pages, then at his face, her expression one of profound empathy. "This is it, isn't it?" she asked softly. "Your voice." Leo nodded, a lump forming in his throat. He felt the hot sting of tears behind his eyes, a feeling of utter, desperate vulnerability. I see he can't," he whispered, the words a choked, broken sound. Rick, he got to me. The laughter. I can hear it already." He buried his face in his hands, the shame and fear overwhelming him. He felt like that 7-year-old boy again, voiceless and terrified. Mrs. Gable let him sit in his silent misery for a long moment, allowing the wave of emotion to wash over him. Then she spoke, her voice not just kind, but infused with a fierce, unwavering strength. "Leo Finch, you lift your head and you look at me," she commanded, her tone leaving no room for argument. He slowly raised his head, his eyes red-rimmed. "You think you're the only one who's ever been afraid? You think you're the only one who's ever been laughed at?" she asked, her gaze intense. "Let me tell you something. When my husband, Frank, died, this diner was failing. The bank was circling like a vulture. People in this town, some of the same people who laugh at Rick Thorne's jokes, they whispered behind my back. 'She'll never make it,' they said. 'A woman can't run a business on her own.' I was terrified, Leo. Every single day, I woke up with a knot of fear in my stomach, so tight I could barely breathe. I wanted to sell. I wanted to run. I wanted to hide." She leaned in, her eyes boring into his. "But then I thought of Frank. I thought of the love and the sweat he poured into this place. I thought of the legacy he left behind. And I got angry. Angry at the whispers, angry at the doubt, angry at my own fear. And that anger, Leo, it became my fuel. It became my strength." She tapped a finger on the pages of his poem. "This," she said, her voice dropping to a powerful whisper, "this is your strength. These words, this truth, this is your heart, Leo. And you're not going to let a small man with a big voice, a man who builds his own worth by tearing down others. Silence your heart. You are not. Her words were a jolt, a current of pure, unadulterated resolve that shot through him, pushing back the tide of fear. She wasn't just offering sympathy. She was offering him a sword, a shield, forged in her own past battles. They will laugh at first, Leo, she continued, her voice softening slightly. Let them show their true, ugly colors. But you have something Rick Thorne will never have. You have authenticity. You have soul. You have a truth that will resonate long after their hollow laughter has faded. You stand up on that stage, and you speak your heart. Not for them. Not for me. For yourself. For your parents. For the soul of this town you love so much. A profound shift occurred within Leo. The fear was still there, a cold, familiar hum in the background. But now, it was accompanied by something new, something fierce and powerful, a righteous, burning anger. Mrs. Gable was right. He was done being afraid. He was done being silent. He carefully folded the pages of his poem and put them in his pocket. He stood up, his posture straighter, his eyes clear and determined. Thank you, Mrs. Gable, he said, and for the first time in a long time, the words came out with a surprising, almost defiant clarity. He walked out of the diner, not as a man retreating from the world, but as a man walking towards his destiny. The quiet librarian was ready for his battle. The day of the Harmony Creek Founders' Day celebration dawned bright and clear, a stark, almost mocking contrast to the storm raging in Leo's soul. The town square was a vibrant tapestry of red, white, and blue bunting, the air filled with the scent of popcorn, grilled hot dogs, and the nervous energy of a community gathered for a spectacle. Families spread blankets on the grass. Children chased each other with miniature flags, and a local high school band played a slightly off-key but enthusiastic rendition of a patriotic march. It was a scene of idyllic, small-town charm, a perfect facade over the simmering tensions and unspoken cruelties that lay beneath. Leo walked through the crowd, a ghost in the midst of the celebration. He felt invisible, yet at the same time, acutely, painfully visible. He saw the familiar faces of his library patrons, the town council members, the shopkeepers from Main Street. Some offered him a brief, pitying smile. Others quickly averted their gaze, their discomfort a palpable thing. He was the town's resident oddity, the stuttering librarian, and today he was the scheduled entertainment, a lamb being led to the slaughter for the amusement of the masses. He made his way to the large, temporary stage that had been erected in front of the town hall. It was draped in patriotic banners, a single microphone standing ominously at its center. Backstage, a small, cordoned-off area, was a chaotic mix of other contestants. A nervous teenage girl with a guitar, a barbershop quartet of elderly men in matching vests, a magician practicing a card trick with fumbling fingers. They all gave Leo a wide berth, their own anxieties compounded by the awkwardness of his presence. He clutched the pages of his poem in his trembling hand, the paper now soft and worn from his constant, nervous handling. He could feel his heart hammering against his ribs, a frantic, trapped bird beating against its cage. The sounds of the crowd, the laughter, the music, all seemed to fade into a dull, distant roar. His focus narrowed to the single, terrifying task that lay before him. He peeked through a gap in the curtain. The square was packed. It seemed as if the entire town had turned out. And there, in the front row, seated in a specially reserved section, was Rick Thorne. He was holding court, surrounded by his cronies, his face flushed with a smug, self-satisfied confidence. He leaned back in his chair, laughing loudly, his gaze sweeping over the crowd as if he were a king surveying his subjects. He was clearly savoring this moment, anticipating the public spectacle of Leo's failure. He caught Leo's eye through the curtain and offered him a slow, deliberate wink, a gesture of pure, unadulterated contempt. The silent taunt sent a fresh wave of ice through Leo's veins. His throat tightened, his palms grew slick with sweat. The old fear, the familiar paralysis, began to creep in. He felt the urge to run, to disappear, to simply melt away into the shadows. Just then, a stagehand, a young man with a clipboard and a harried expression, called out the names of the contestants. The barbershop quartet went first, their harmonies sweet but forgettable. The teenage girl followed, her voice thin and nervous, her fingers stumbling on the guitar strings. The crowd offered polite, scattered applause, their attention already beginning to wander, their anticipation clearly focused on the main event, Leo's impending humiliation. Then, the stagehand called his name. And now, offering us his thoughts on the spirit of Harmony Creek, Mr. Leo Finch. A strange, electric silence fell over the crowd, followed by a ripple of hushed whispers and a few poorly suppressed snickers. Leo could hear Rick Thorne's distinct, booming laugh from the front row. This was it, the moment of truth. He felt Mrs. Gable's words echoing in his mind. Let them laugh. Let them show their true, ugly colors. He took a deep, shuddering breath, the air feeling thin and insufficient. He thought of his parents. He thought of the old theater. He thought of his poem, his truth, clutched in his hand. He pushed aside the curtain and walked out onto the stage, into the bright, unforgiving glare of the afternoon sun, his heart a roaring inferno in his chest. The walk to the microphone felt like a mile-long journey across a barren, hostile landscape. Every eye was on him, 1,000 points of judgment, of pity, of cruel expectation. He was alone, exposed, utterly vulnerable. He had never felt more terrified in his entire life. Leo reached the microphone, his hand shaking so violently he could barely adjust its height. The metal stand felt cold and alien under his touch. He looked out at the sea of faces, a blur of indistinct features, all focused on him, waiting. He could feel their collective skepticism, their morbid curiosity. In the front row, Rick Thorne's face was a clear, sharp beacon of malice, his smirk a physical blow. The silence stretched, becoming a heavy, suffocating blanket. It was his turn to speak. The world seemed to hold its breath. He opened his mouth, and the familiar, hated enemy, his stutter, sprang its trap. "GGG, good afternoon." He began, the words a mangled, choked sound. The dam of polite silence broke. A wave of snickers rippled through the crowd, starting with Rick's cronies and spreading outwards. Someone in the back let out a loud, open laugh. Rick Thorne leaned back in his chair, his arms crossed, his expression one of pure, unadulterated triumph. This was even better than he had imagined. Leo's face burned with a shame so intense it was dizzying. He wanted to run, to vanish, to simply cease to exist. He felt the weight of 1,000 past humiliations crashing down on him. He was failing. He was proving them all right. He was, and always would be, LL Leo the librarian. He closed his eyes, shutting out their faces, their laughter. The world went dark. In that self-imposed darkness, a different sound emerged, a quiet, steady rhythm from the recesses of his memory. The rhythm of his poem. The cadence of his secret rehearsals in the hallowed silence of the library. He heard Mrs. Gable's voice. "Speak your heart, Leo." He took a deep, shuddering breath, a desperate gulp of air. And then he let go. He let go of the need to speak. He let go of the fear of their judgment. He let go of the man they thought he was. He opened his eyes, but he wasn't looking at them anymore. He was looking through them, at the old clock tower, at the memory of the ancient oak, at the soul of his town. And he began again, not with a stuttered greeting, but with the first line of his poem. His voice was different. It was a low, resonant murmur, imbued with a strange, musical quality. He wasn't speaking. He was reciting, chanting, his words flowing on a current of pure, unadulterated rhythm. "There is a quiet," he began, his voice steady, the stutter miraculously, impossibly gone, "that lives in the cracks of old sidewalks, a history whispered by the wind through the eaves of tired, faithful buildings. A soul that cannot be bulldozed, a heart that cannot be bought or sold." The crowd, which had been poised for more laughter, was stunned into a sudden, profound silence. The change was so abrupt, so dramatic, that it was almost disorienting. The voice they were hearing was not the voice of the man they had mocked. This voice was rich, powerful, and filled with an emotion so raw and authentic it was almost painful to hear. Leo continued, his voice growing stronger, more confident with each line. The words of his poem, once just ink on a page, came to life, painting a vivid, heartbreakingly beautiful portrait of Harmony Creek. He spoke of the calloused hands that built this town, the silent prayers that held it together. He spoke of the shared sorrows and quiet joys that are the true mortar in these old brick walls. His performance was mesmerizing. He wasn't just reciting words. He was conducting an orchestra of emotion, his hands gesturing subtly, his body swaying with the rhythm of his own language. He was no longer a stutterer. He was a bard, a troubadour, a weaver of words. The snickers had died, replaced by a rapt, disbelieving silence. The faces in the crowd, once filled with mockery, were now etched with a mixture of awe, confusion, and a dawning, uncomfortable shame. They were not just hearing a poem. They were being forced to see their town, and themselves, through Leo's eyes, and the reflection was not entirely flattering. He was holding up a mirror to their own casual cruelty, their own blindness to the beauty that lay right before them. The quiet librarian had found his voice, and it was a voice that could not be ignored. Leo's voice, a force of nature unleashed, washed over the town square, each word a brushstroke on a canvas of shared memory. He was no longer looking at the crowd. He was channeling something ancient and powerful, the collective soul of the town he loved. His poem moved from the quiet, intimate details of Harmony Creek to a passionate, searing indictment of the soulless progress that threatened to erase it. They offer us a future of polished stone and empty promises, he recited, his voice ringing with a righteous, indignant fire, his gaze, for the first time, locking directly onto Rick Thorne. A gateway to nowhere, built on the graves of our memories. They call it revitalization, but it is a hollowing out, a trade of our heart for a handful of silver. They want to pave over our past, to silence the whispers of our history. But our history is not dead weight. It is the bedrock upon which we stand. The power of his words, the sheer, unassailable truth of his message, held the crowd in a spellbound trance. The air was thick with an emotion so intense it was almost a physical presence. People who had come to laugh were now listening with a rapt, almost painful attention. They were seeing their town, their home, not as a collection of outdated buildings, but as a living, breathing entity, a legacy they were on the verge of carelessly discarding. He spoke of the old community theater, not as a derelict building, but as a cathedral of first loves and shared dreams. He spoke of the small, family-owned shops, not as relics of a bygone era, but as the beating heart of our community. His words were a poignant, powerful elegy for a way of life that was being threatened by greed and indifference. Then, his poem turned inward, becoming a deeply personal, heartbreakingly vulnerable confession. He spoke of his own silence, his own struggle. I, too, have been a forgotten story, he recited, his voice dropping to a near whisper, yet carrying to the furthest corners of the square. A book with a broken spine, my words trapped behind a wall of fear. You have heard my struggle, but you have not heard my song. You have seen my weakness, but you have not seen my love. A love for this town that is as deep and as constant as the river that runs through it. The raw, unvarnished honesty of his words was a devastating blow. The crowd, which had once been a monolithic entity of mockery, was now a collection of individuals, each one forced to confront their own role in his silent suffering. The shame was palpable. Faces that had once been twisted in derision were now etched with a deep, profound remorse. He saw Mrs. Gable in the crowd, her face streaked with tears, a proud, loving smile on her lips. He saw Mayor Thompson, his usual bluster gone, looking down at his hands, a look of genuine regret on his face. He even saw a few of the teenagers who had once mocked him, now looking at him with a newfound, grudging respect. And then he looked at Rick Thorne. The golden boy's confident smirk had vanished, replaced by a mask of stunned, incredulous horror. The crowd was not laughing. They were not cheering for him. They were looking at him, at Rick, with a new, dawning sense of revulsion. He was no longer the charismatic leader. He was the villain in Leo's powerful, undeniable narrative. The power dynamic had not just shifted, it had been utterly, spectacularly reversed. Leo finished his poem with a final, quiet, powerful line. Do not let them silence our heart. For our heart is the only home we truly have. He stood there, his chest heaving, the last word hanging in the profound, absolute silence. For a long, breathless moment, no one moved. No one spoke. The entire town seemed to be suspended in a state of collective shock and revelation. Then, a single sound broke the silence. A pair of hands, clapping slowly, deliberately. It was Mrs. Gable. She was on her feet, her eyes shining with pride. Her solitary applause was a catalyst. Another person stood, then another, then a dozen, then 100. The polite, scattered applause of before was replaced by a thunderous, roaring ovation, a wave of sound that was not just appreciation, but a catharsis, an apology, a celebration. It was a roar of vindication, of a community finding its soul again, led by its most unlikely hero. Rick Thorne sat frozen in his front row seat, the sound of the applause washing over him like a tidal wave, drowning him in his own public humiliation. He was a king dethroned, his power shattered by the very man he had so relentlessly tried to crush. The stuttering librarian had not just found his voice, he had become the voice of Harmony Creek. The ovation continued for what felt like an eternity, a sustained, heartfelt roar of a community awakening from a long, collective slumber. Leo stood on the stage, the sound washing over him, a wave of acceptance and validation so powerful it almost brought him to his knees. The fear, the shame, the years of silent suffering, it all seemed to dissolve in the warmth of their genuine, overwhelming applause. He looked out at the sea of faces, and for the first time, he saw not pity or mockery, but respect, admiration, and a deep, profound sense of connection. The judges for the Voice of Harmony Creek contest, a panel of local dignitaries, including a visibly moved Mayor Thompson, were rendered irrelevant. The people had already chosen their winner. The contest was over. The grand prize was his. But the real prize was something far more valuable than $1,000 or the honor of lighting a bonfire. It was the reclamation of his own voice, his own spirit. As the applause finally began to subside, Mayor Thompson, his face a mixture of remorse and genuine admiration, walked onto the stage. He took the microphone, his hand trembling slightly. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice uncharacteristically subdued, "I think it's safe to say that we have heard the true voice of Harmony Creek today. And it is a voice of profound truth, of courage, and of a deep, abiding love for this town." He turned to Leo, his eyes filled with a new, sincere respect. "Leo, on behalf of the town council, and on behalf of myself, I want to offer you our deepest, most sincere apologies. We were blind. We were deaf. We were wrong. You have reminded us of what truly matters, of the soul of this community that we were on the verge of carelessly selling away." He then turned back to the crowd. "And I want to announce, officially, that the Harmony Creek Gateway Project, as proposed by Mr. Thorne, is hereby suspended. We will be holding a series of new public forums to discuss the future of our downtown. Forums where every voice, especially voices like Mr. Finch's, will be heard and respected." The announcement was met with another roar of approval. Rick Thorne, his face a thunderous mask of rage and humiliation, stood up abruptly and stormed away, pushing through the crowd, his golden boy image tarnished beyond repair. He was no longer the town's charismatic leader. He was a disgraced developer, his greed and cruelty exposed for all to see. His power, built on a foundation of intimidation and false promises, had been shattered by the simple, undeniable power of a poet's truth. In the days and weeks that followed, a profound, lasting change settled over Harmony Creek. The town began to heal. People started talking to each other again, not with gossip and whispers, but with a newfound sense of shared purpose. The plan to demolish the historic downtown was replaced by a community-led restoration project, with local volunteers working together to preserve the old buildings, including the beloved community theater. Leo became a local hero, a quiet, unassuming celebrity. People no longer saw Leo the librarian. They saw Leo Finch, the man who had spoken his heart and saved their town. They would stop him on the street, not to mock, but to thank him, to share a story, to ask his opinion. He still had his stutter in casual conversation, a quiet reminder of his journey, but it no longer held him prisoner. He was no longer defined by his struggle, but by his strength. The library, his sanctuary, became a vibrant community hub, a place where people gathered not just for books, but for connection, for conversation, for the quiet wisdom of the man who had become their town's conscience. Mrs. Gable's diner was always full, the air buzzing with a new, optimistic energy. Leo would still sit in his corner booth, but he was no longer alone, his table often filled with friends and neighbors who had come to value his quiet presence and his thoughtful, heartfelt words. He had found his place, not in the margins, but at the very heart of his community. His life, once a study in quiet despair, had become a testament to the enduring power of the human spirit. The narrator's voice comes in, full of warmth and inspiration. It is a story that reminds us that a person's true voice is not always found in the fluency of their speech, but in the courage of their convictions, in the truth of their heart. Leo Finch, a man who was silenced by fear and misunderstanding, discovered that his greatest perceived weakness was, in fact, the source of his most profound strength. He taught Harmony Creek and all of us that the most powerful words are not always the loudest, but the most authentic. And in his quiet, courageous act of taking the stage, he did not just find his own voice. He helped an entire town rediscover its soul, proving that even the most broken of voices can sing a song of redemption, a song that can bring a crowd to tears and a community back to life.